Hi everyone, you've reached Lecture 3, Confronting and Reclaiming Racial Stereotypes. This lecture needs to be watched and completed by Wednesday, June 15th. The stoic, heroic cowboy of few words, the dashing, swashbuckling hero, the rebellious rich girl in need of rescue, and the evil, money-grubbing villain. Ever wonder why our entertainment media is so full of these familiar character archetypes? Looking back at the last century of moving images, we can recognize the ways that U.S. entertainment media has historically used these characters as shorthand ways of communicating stories to audiences. These images reiterated character personality traits that were so powerful, frequent, and so unambiguous that audiences would understand the character, the genre, and the situation the first time he or she appeared on screen. So, for example, when audiences saw Humphrey Bogart walk into a Nazi-occupied tavern in war-torn Casablanca, or when audiences saw $1,000,000-to-1 long shot Rocky Balboa enter the fighting ring against a superior but cocky opponent, the audiences were not only seeing familiar archetypes, but iconic symbols that would make complex situations easier to comprehend by triggering recall of preconceived assumptions. There is, however, a dangerously thin line between archetypes and stereotypes, which is also a categorization of various identity types based on a familiar shorthand for describing people. But the key difference with stereotypes is that they often begin with unsupported and unfounded logic. They assume that everyone of a certain group is naturally inclined to exhibit these traits, thus undermining the complexity of human diversity. And they proliferate erroneous perceptions to naive and uncritical audiences. Stereotypes even become more problematic when they are used to favor certain groups over others, and because historically U.S. media industries have adhered to the dominant ideology of white patriarchal capitalism, depictions of racial minorities on screen have been minimal, stereotypical, and oftentimes harmful. So this week we will be looking at depictions of race in U.S. media. Specifically, we will be examining 4 racial groups: Black, Latino and Latina, Native American, and Asian. All of these groups have historically been, and unfortunately continue to be, most commonly represented through stereotypes and false assumptions rather than authentic and nuanced representations. Now, while stereotypes in the media are symbols, which are almost always unequivocally harmful, it would be a mistake to overlook or selectively ignore their significance and legacy. As our media becomes more racially diverse, both in front of and behind the camera, it is important to always be aware of the historical and social implications of stereotypes, and rather than completely remove ourselves from their ugly manifestations in the past, we must actively confront them and reclaim our racial identities. So, in this lecture, we will be drawing from, the readings of Donald Bogle and Charles Ramirez Berg, which characterize some of the most common and bigoted stereotypes, as well as prominent instances of those in media representations. Now, you'll notice that the Berg and Bogle readings are labeled as optional, although highly recommended, in our course syllabus. And this is done for 2 reasons. The first reason is that the screenings for this week do not always perfectly reinforce each of the precise stereotypes outlined by the authors. Instead, the screenings this week offer more sophisticated portrayals of non-white characters, which often belie the traditional assumptions that have enabled harmful stereotypes. And the second reason that these articles are optional relates back to Shohat and Stam's reading from last week, The Limits of Stereotype, where the authors write that preoccupations with stereotyped imagery can lead, perhaps ironically or unintentionally, to a kind of essentialism in its own right, where complex varieties of stereotype portrayals are reduced to a limited set of formulas. So, in other words, talking about stereotypes is difficult not only because of the danger of unconsciously endorsing their ideologies, but because their belief systems are institutionalized and pervasive rather than individual and isolated. It would be a mistake to attribute the popularity of stereotypes to a single racist filmmaker or genre or studio, but instead racism in the media is the byproduct of widespread ideological assumptions, conscious and unconscious, reinforcing the supposed biological and intellectual superiority of Caucasian Americans. So let's look at Berg's article first. Bogle. Bogle is introducing 5 types of stereotyped black characters, which, while not always originating in film, nonetheless dictated the limited spectrum of roles that early black actors could play in the earlier days of film and television. So this is the first type that Bogle is discussing, the Tom. You can see the Tom sitting here, standing up. So the Tom was named after the titular character in Harriet Beecher Stowe's legendary anti-slavery novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was actually the most commonly adapted story in the silent film era. They made approximately 9 or 10 different film versions of this novel because of how popular it was. The Tom was designed as a socially acceptable character for white audiences, meaning that however much harassment or flogging or discrimination or humiliation he was forced to endure from his white superiors, he nonetheless remained a loyal, docile, and non-threatening domestic caretaker to whites, perhaps because he never knew of or desired a life of anything else. Now, it is important to note that Uncle Tom's Cabin was written as an anti-slavery novel, but the Tom was a caricature that was directed toward white audiences, skeptical white audiences, which meant that, again, he was portrayed as a docile, submissive, wholly loyal black character to whites and was non-threatening. And we would characterize this today as, of course, a very racist portrayal. So let's move on to Bogle's second type, which is the coon. The coon presented blacks as buffoons and objects of amusement. Coons were lazy, unreliable, stupid, and subhuman characters which stole and cheated and stuttered and lusted haplessly after white women. Their foibles, resulting in comedic humiliation and reprimanding, were a reminder to white audiences that blacks were not only uneducated and ignorant, but they were perfectly happy to be publicly degraded, and thus they served as a ringing endorsement of racism and institutionalized punishment for blacks. And a lot of coons in the silent era were played by white actors in blackface, adding insult to injury. So Bogle's 2 female black types fit into 2 extremes. One extreme is the tragic mulatto, and the tragic mulatto is a woman born of mixed race, usually a white master and a black female slave. And the tragic mulatto believes that she is white until a tragic revelation resurfaces and awakens her to her shameful and tattered biracial identity, at which point she reacts typically by killing herself. Thus, she promotes the idea that for a white person, or at least a person passing as white, death is preferable than having a single drop of black blood in one's body. The other type of black female character discussed by Bogle is the mammy. The mammy is the plus-size, desexualized domestic servant who washed white people's clothes and dishes and raised white children while ignoring her own. And although she occasionally demonstrated sass to her white employers, she was nonetheless very loyal to her black employers, as loyal as the Tom. Mammies were not afforded names of their own oftentimes, as you see in Gone with the Wind. And the best-known mammy, played by Hattie McDaniel, as seen here in Gone with the Wind, actually remained the most iconic black female movie character, as well as the only black actress to receive an Academy Award until 1990.
Scoot up the attic, Mammy, and get down Ma's old box of dress patterns.
What you up to with Miss Ellen's Portier?
You're gonna make me a new dress.
Not with Miss Ellen's Portier, not while I got breath in my body.
Great balls! I'm my Portier now. I'm going to Atlanta for that $300, and I've got to go looking like a queen.
Who's going to Atlanta with you?
I'm going alone.
That's what you think. I was going to Atlanta with you in that new dress.
Oh, Mammy, darling.
No use to try to sweet talk me, Miss Scarlett. I know you ever since.
So even though the mammy caricature is sometimes the voice of reason, she's still presented as wholly submissive to the white woman that she works for. In this case, Scarlett O'Hara, who in many ways is much more clueless than Mammy. Bogle's final type, the buck, is the most threatening of all the caricatures to white audiences because of his brute physical strength and unremitting desire for violence against whites, and especially sexual violence against white women. So brutes grew most directly out of the white fear that blacks would lead insurrections against white society. The brute served as a warning that any form of black empowerment and liberation, no matter how seemingly democratic or moral, would inevitably lead to a chaotic collapse of white American society. So this was best illustrated in the clip you're seeing here from D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation from 1915, which was actually the most widely seen and highest grossing American movie until the 1940s, until Gone with the Wind. And the climactic scene of Birth of a Nation occurs when the escaped slave, Gus, chases the chaste white little sister, Elsie, through the forest until she leaps to her death off a cliff, as you see here in this scene. So once again, this reiterates the notion that when faced with the prospect of sexual relations between the races, death really is the only option for white people. And it's worth noting that the popularity of this movie, Birth of a Nation, was so large that it led to a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan in many areas across the country for the next several decades. So we're going to move to Berg's article on Latino representation. Now, Berg is also using some of the same kind of insidious titles that Bogle describes. The most prominent stereotype discussed here is El Bandito, the Mexican bandit of countless westerns and adventure films, who is treacherous, dishonest, violent toward whites, and whose fragmented use of English is a reminder of his feeble intellect. So although westerns are no longer the preferred genre of American audiences, Berg writes that El Bandito still lives on in contemporary Hollywood through the incarnations of the Latin American drug dealer, for example, as well as the inner city gangster. Now, paralleling the black coon is the Latino buffoon, who shares the bandito's disdain for whites, but whose simple-mindedness, lack of physical size, and dialect make him less of a threat than an amusing, childish, comedic supporting character. The Latin buffoon is a harmful caricature because he reinforces the notion that Latin men are uneducated, unmotivated, and incapable of holding positions of power because the Latino buffoon's function within the narratives is purely to provide laughs at the expense of his own cultural heritage. So, as with the black types, Berg describes the ways in which Latin women, Latinas, are sexualized in exaggerated and demeaning ways, particularly when it comes to interracial sex. So here's the harlot. The harlot is a seductress who lusts after males in order to satisfy not just an inherent sexual craving, but which endorses the idea that the Latin male lover is actually insufficient. But the harlot also lusts after white males for the purposes of shrewd upward social and economic mobility among white culture, as you can see in this clip. Thus, the harlot is given agency through only her sexual promiscuity and prowess, less motivated by a sexual impulse than the far more diabolical desire to subvert the white patriarchy. So it's actually interesting because our film for this Tuesday, Real Women Have Curves, directly confronts the stereotype that Latina women's sexuality is defined by their body size, or curves, which threaten the Western sexual ideal of the demure and chaste white-skinned woman. On the other side of the spectrum is the female clown, who is just as oversexed as the harlot, but whose facile, limited intellect functions as a reminder to the white male protagonist that they can redeem themselves from moral and racial transgressions if they reject the Latina and return to their normalized Anglo-heterosexual relationship. And that's what happens at the end of this clip, is the privileged white man must reject the sexual temptations of the Latina for fear of transgressing Anglo standards of romance and sexuality. Okay. Critiquing stereotypes. So, in what ways might Bogle and Berg be critiqued, and why is this important for our class? Well, we know that Shohat and Stam might say that essentializing stereotypes through circumscribed formulas is problematic. And Shohat and Stem write on page 811 of their article that the more subtle, deeper forms of discursively and institutionally sanctioned racism remain unrecognized. Thus, for every unambiguous representation of a mammy or Tom or harlot, there are innumerable other forms of racist representations which are less blatantly observable. Now, it's also important to remember that these racial types are not static and stationary at a single historical moment, but they're fluid and changing and alternating throughout the history of film and TV, and are no less problematic and harmful today as they were generations ago. Considering Bogle and Berg is important because when we recognize stereotypes as well as their historical roots, we are not just identifying characters and types, but really we're recognizing manifestations of deeper racist symbols, ideologies, and heritage. However, it's also important to remember what Shohat and Stam remind us, that the discourse has to go beyond simply labeling something racist to understanding the sophisticated cultural context for why such a label would exist in the first place. So that being said, this is the conclusion of Lecture 3, Confronting and Reclaiming Racial Stereotypes. I will see you later in the week.